Hello students, in this video we're going to discuss climate. At the end of this module, students will be able to differentiate between climate and weather, follow the pathway of heat energy transfer through oceans and the atmosphere, and discuss how Earth systems interact with each other to affect global and local climate patterns. As always, pause the video and write down these vocabulary words and their definitions. Remember to write down questions that you have and questions that you predict might be on future assessments. So as we were discussing in the last video, when talking about the definition of ecology, the abiotic factors related to ecological systems are largely associated with where you are on the planet in latitude or elevation. So as we look at the Earth and the Sun here in not exactly in relative position, but just in geometric position, we see that the sun's rays do not hit the Earth straight on because the Earth's axis is tilted 23.5 degrees. So in this picture, the Earth's axis is tilted away from the sun. But what we want to see is that near to the equator, the radiation hits a small unit area because it hits the surface of the Earth more directly. But then as we move away from the equator towards the poles, the sun's rays per unit area affect a larger area, but then are less intense. So we see that higher latitudes get less direct radiation, and lower latitudes get more direct radiation. So here's some other ways to look at this. So when we're thinking about changes, seasonal changes, it has to do with these two ways that the Earth is moving. So there we see the 23-degree tilt again in the left, and then on the right we see the Earth in the middle, and as the sun in the middle, and as the Earth moves around the sun, following that bright red line, this is like a year, okay? And then every day the Earth is spinning on its axis. That's the pink little circle, and this is a day. So depending on where the axis is tilted as the Earth moves around the sun, this gives us seasons. So when in the northern hemisphere the axis is tilted towards the sun, it is summer. So we can see in the image of the Earth at summer solstice that more of the northern hemisphere is pointing towards the sun and experiencing day in this diagram. Then if we look on the far right at winter solstice, we see that the axis is pointed away from the sun. And then look up there in the northern hemisphere, more of the sun is shaded more of the Earth is shaded in every single day because of this orientation. And then at the equinoxes, as their names imply, we have equal day and equal night because the orientation of the axis is neither towards nor away from the sun. So all of this direct sunlight that the Earth experiences in equatorial regions moves and expands the air. As this air moves poleward, it cools and descends. So this makes a convection cycle of heated air and cool air moving around the planet. Then the Earth's rotation, that rotation of a day, causes the Coriolis effect. So this creates most climate patterns. There are several circulation cells on the planet of these heated and cool air circulating. So these blue bubbles around the edges of the Earth are representing that passage of cool descending air and warm ascending air. Okay, so when we look right at the temperature associated with these, we see that the Hadley cells converging at the equator create this intertidal convergence zone. So right around the equator, it's warmer, there's a lot more moisture. But then on either side of those Hadley cells, we have zones of less moisture, and then more moisture, and then less, and it goes like that all the way up to the poles. But as far as temperature goes, we can see here that it's warmer near the equator because of that direct radiation, and cooler in general, annual average temperature at the poles. So what we see from these convection cells is that warmer water, in addition to air, is moving towards the polar latitudes, and cooler water that has sunk at the poles is now moving back towards the equator. So even though we can make a generalized statement about where these currents are going at any time, changes in where those currents are moving exactly gives rise to things like El Nino and La Nina, and currents can alter the expected weather patterns subsequently. Now let's just take a moment before we leave this slide to look down in the bottom right at this global map. We see a lot of movement of water in the western direction. We can see all these arrows moving towards the west, and these are the westerlies, and these are produced in that intertidal convergence zone at the equatorial regions. These westerly winds are called the trade winds because they facilitated early trade routes. So, just as we were looking at the map of annual temperature, in this map of sea surface temperature, we can see that the same temperature patterns that we saw in the air temperature map. It is warmer, the surface of the water is being heated at equatorial regions from the direct solar radiation. That warmer water is moving towards the poles where it sinks and then travels back towards the equator. Alright, so let's take a look at how moisture and air move across the landscape. So here in Colorado, our prevailing winds are westerly winds, and we sometimes get more coastal storms in the spring, but these graphics are going to be talking mostly about the westerly winds we experience. So if you imagine that these mountain ranges that we're seeing here are the Rocky Mountains. So the Continental Divide is right where that snow-capped peak is on the left, or the highest point in the diagram on the right. So our westerly winds, they're moving across the continent, and as winds move across the continent, they gather moisture. When the air is forced uphill as the landscape starts to gain elevation, just like how the currents are moving towards the poles, air that moves uphill is moving into zones of lower pressure and lower temperature, and cooler air holds less moisture. So what we find is that we have our big snowstorms created by these westerly winds in the Rocky Mountains on the western slope. As the air crests over the Continental Divide and descends on the Rocky Mountain front and keeps traveling eastward, as seen in the far right of this diagram here, that air begins to warm and begins to gather moisture. But as it descends the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, it's in a rain shadow. The moisture that was in that moving air mass has fallen on the western slope, and the dry air advances down the eastern slope, and that is why we have such dry desert-like conditions in the eastern plains of Colorado. So, as we looked through these various models of how temperature in air and moisture influence our global climate and environments, we differentiated between climate and weather. We followed the pathway of heat energy transfer through oceans in the atmosphere, and we discussed how Earth systems interact with each other to affect global and local climate patterns. Let me know if you have any questions.